Hello. Today we're going to talk about the British wartime economy. Now, Britain's economy during the war was very complicated. It involved the interplay of a huge number of different factors. And because of the complexity of this topic, I thought it would be best to have an introductory video just explaining some of the terms, some of the key ideas, and how they link together and what the background was, or what the situation was at the start of the war. And then we'll look more specifically at some of the things that you can be asked in the exam, a couple of the essays that you can write later on. Remember that the economy is a part of the course that can only come up as an essay question. So in essence, you don't have to focus on it. However, having an understanding of how the economy relates to various different parts of the course can be very beneficial in terms of understanding how different factors kind of connect to each other, and also it can really add things to various different essays. When we're thinking about it in terms of the World War II course, there's three essays where the economy is kind of the core of the essay, or the kind of central part, and those are the unemployment and inequality stuff in the 1930s. So the situation in the 1930s, how bad unemployment was, and the extent to which inequality was a problem. That is obviously a big part. The economy obviously plays a central part in those questions. Then you get questions about the success of the economy during the war, how good it was, how effective it was. And you can get questions about either industry by itself or industry and agriculture together. I don't think there's ever been a question on just agriculture, but there has been a question on just industry. And as I said, the economy can also form a part of other essays in areas of the course, such as the fall of Chamberlain. Obviously, the economic situation was very important to the fall of Chamberlain. Churchill as a war leader, so how effective Churchill was, obviously the economy played a really important part in that. And then preparations for war, how prepared Britain was, forms a very important part of the economy, forms a very important part of that aspect of the course too. And obviously preparations for war and the fall of Chamberlain quite strongly linked, because Chamberlain obviously directly responsible for most of the war preparations, especially the ones in terms of the direct factors that affected the economy. Now, the economy a lot, and I think so. It's important, I think, just to keep in our heads a clear idea of what an economy actually is. So, when we're talking about the economy of a country, what we're really referring to is a few things. First of all, the amount of goods and services it produces. So, goods are just things that a country makes: cars, turnips, shoes, bottles of whiskey, whatever. And services are things that are kind of a bit more intangible. So, um, architects provide services when they draw up plans. Banks provide services when they look after your money. Tutors provide services when they teach you how to do something. The person selling you a coffee is providing you a service. The person delivering your mail is providing you a service. So their services are things that aren't actually created. They're things that are provided for you, whereas goods are actually kind of concrete, tangible things that you can touch. Obviously, the economy is massively dependent on money, and so when we're thinking about the economy, we have to understand how much money there is, where this money comes from, and who has it, in order to understand what the economy is doing. And of course, this leads on to jobs. So, types of jobs, the levels of unemployment, the amount people are paid, the conditions that they work in, the ability to find new jobs or change jobs, all those sort of things are very important to the economy. So, a country tends to experience economic problems when there's a deficiency in one of the above factors. So, if there aren't enough goods or services in the country, that is a big problem. If there's not enough money, that is a big problem. And obviously, if there are not enough jobs, the economy will be in trouble. However, somewhat bizarrely, countries can also get into trouble if they have too much of the above things. So having too many goods or services can cause problems. Having too much money can cause a lot of problems as well. And oddly enough, sometimes having too many jobs can cause a lot of problems, because having too many people in employment can lead to quite significant inflation, which is something that can happen, because if everybody's in a job, then it makes it very difficult for companies to attract employees, and then the only way for them to attract employees is to offer more money, and employees realise that they've kind of got the power, and that can cause a lot of issues. So in order to understand the British economy during the war, we have to understand what the country is producing, who's producing it, and how they're paying for it. So those are the three things to kind of keep in your head. So when we're thinking about the British economy during the war, services is something we can largely ignore. It is important to some extent, but basically we're mainly going to focus on goods because we're thinking about the food that Britain produces and the war materials that it produces. Services are less of an importance, in fact, become significantly less important during the war. And then obviously the goods that it brings in from abroad and how it pays for all those different things. Obviously, when we're talking about the economy, there's quite a lot of complex language. The vocabulary involved in any economic topic can be quite difficult, can be quite challenging. So having an understanding of a few of the key terms is essential. And also, if you use the key terms effectively in essays, it makes you sound like you know what you're talking about, which adds to the kind of thoroughness. And analysing by using these kind of key terms can be very beneficial and make your essay sound sophisticated. And also, having an understanding of these key terms is quite important just to be a well-rounded and useful citizen, because if you can understand how the economy works, then it makes you a much more effective contributor to society, because it means that you know who to vote for, because if politicians tell you one thing about the economy and you have a pretty good grasp of economic theory, then you can usually tell when they're lying, which they obviously do tend to do. So, a few of the key terms for World War II. Inflation. Inflation is just the increase in prices and the decline in value of money. If you think about it, it's quite easy to think about the fact that prices tend to go up. You know, a pint of milk maybe used to cost 30 pence, and it costs 35 pence, and it costs 40 pence, and it costs 45 pence. So as the prices of goods go up, that means that the money in your pocket is worth less. So that is inflation. Consumer goods, very important during the war, because they don't really contribute to the war effort massively. So having fewer consumer goods is something that the British government realises they have to do. They have to cut down on the production of consumer goods, and consumer goods are just things that are bought to be used. So if you buy yourself a chocolate bar, it's a consumer good. If you buy yourself a DVD, that's a consumer good. However, if you buy yourself a saw for your business, because you want to go and build someone a bookcase, the saw isn't a consumer good because you're using it to produce something else. So consumer goods are things that are bought to be used, not bought to make things. Import, which are goods or services bought from foreign countries. So if you buy a car from Germany, you have imported it. Exports are goods sold to foreign countries. So if you sell a car to Germany, then you have exported it. And balance of payments is the difference between those two things. The difference between the amount of goods and services a country imports and the goods and services a country exports. Now, if you have more exports than imports, or your exports are worth more than your imports, you're in a balance of payments surplus. That's generally seen as a good thing. And if you're importing more than you're exporting, then you're having a balance of payments deficit, and that is generally seen as a bad thing. So obviously during the war, Britain massively has a balance of payments deficit. It has an almost unbelievably large deficit, which contrasts to the country that Britain had been before the war, particularly before World War I, when it could say that it was massively a balance of payments surplus, in that it sold a lot more abroad in terms of goods and particularly services than it did in terms of imports. Currency reserves are a very important question at the moment, to do with Brexit and Scottish independence and various other things. It's about how much control the government has over their own currency. And one of the ways you can have control over your own currency is to hold a lot of foreign currency. Because if you hold a lot of foreign currency, so if the British government holds a lot of dollars and euros and yen, then it means that if anything happens to the British economy, if it begins to collapse, then people will still be confident that the British government can afford to pay their bills, because they have a large surplus in currency reserves. You can also have currency reserves can also include things like gold, so it doesn't just have to be actual pounds and pence, and well, it wouldn't be pounds and pence, but dollars and cents. It doesn't have to be money. It can be other things. So having lots of currency reserves is quite a good thing. At the start of the war, Britain had quite a large surplus in terms of currency reserves, but they disappeared almost instantly because Britain was forced to pay for things in foreign currency from America in order to because the Americans weren't quite confident that they would be able to afford them otherwise. And perhaps the most interesting and illuminative part of economics is taxes, especially when we're thinking about Britain and the war. Taxes are just fees that people and businesses pay to the government. So if you pay a lot of taxes, then you're contributing massively to government spending. And income tax is just an element of that. It's a percentage of a person's income that's paid to the government. So the British economy and World War II is something that we have to kind of think about in terms of a few important key questions. So first of all, think about what state the economy was in at the outbreak of war, what measures were introduced by Chamberlain once the war broke out, what changes Churchill made, so that there are significant differences between Chamberlain's economic policy and Churchill's economic policy. Some people would argue that Churchill went too far and things like that, but we will look at that later. How important Lend-Lease was, so basically the loans from America and aid from the Empire. There's lots of foreign of Britain, the British Commonwealth gave Britain quite a significant amount of money, in particular Canada gives Britain $1 billion, which is very nice of them. The domestic measures introduced to help fund the war, Britain did various things in order to raise money from her own people in order to pay for the huge expense that was brought on by the war. The changes that occurred in British industry, obviously wholesale, huge revolution basically in the British industry during the war, and the changes in terms of British agriculture, obviously with the Battle of the Atlantic and things like that, and the attempt of the Germans to limit supplies into Britain. British agriculture became really important. The more food that Britain could produce for itself, the less it had to import, the less ships were needed, and the more ship space that could be used for war materials. And finally, an overall question, was the British economy successful? Did they do well during the war? And that's something that we must think about, because that is one of the key essay questions. Finally, we're going to look at the basic background. So during Chamberlain's leadership, what was going on? What did Chamberlain do, and what did he do badly? First thing, overall, Chamberlain did not do well. He didn't focus on a total war footing for the economy. He didn't focus the economy on an attempt to build up the British armed forces. He didn't get massive numbers of people involved. There's still 1 million people unemployed. That's probably one of the main things to think about. And if you're writing about the preparations for war, or you're writing about Chamberlain's resignation, that's a very important figure. Chamberlain also focused on increasing exports in order to fund what he thought would be a long war. He wanted to create a balance of payment surplus, because he thought by doing that, it would mean that Britain would have a lot of money, and with a lot of money they could manage to survive in the war for a long time, whereas Germany would be bankrupt. The British were still producing a lot of inessential goods, footballs and cars for personal use, and dresses and furniture and all those kind of things. Consumer goods that were not essential to the war effort. The British were not focused on producing armaments. There wasn't direction towards that. The British did buy a lot of arms in from America, but they had to do that under what was called the cash and carry plan. That meant that they had to pay for them where they bought them, and they had to pay for them in dollars and gold. So that meant that they ran down their currency reserves and very quickly ran out of money. And according to one of the chief historians of Britain's economy during the war, Corelli Barnett, that Britain was faced with the inevitability of ultimate bankruptcy and collapse by 1940. This basically meant, because the balance of payments was around 400 million in the first year of the war, and it would only go up. So the government knew this level of spending was unsustainable and that something had to be done. Basically, Britain was going to be bankrupt if they didn't do something. Unless something changed, they wouldn't be able to afford to keep on fighting. And that was the situation that Churchill found himself in when he became Prime Minister in mid-1940 and was faced with, very soon, the defeat of France, the hegemony of Germany in Europe, certainly in Western Europe, and the very real possibility that Britain would go bankrupt. And so, when you're writing an essay about Britain's economy, having an understanding of the situation of Chamberlain is important, but you're really going to write about Churchill and what Churchill did. So what happened from kind of May 1940 onwards. And that is going to form the core of your essay. You'll talk about the various things that he introduced and his relationship with Lend-Lease and the changes he made to industry and the changes he made to agriculture, and that should fully inform your essay. Hopefully that has given you a good beginning of an understanding of the context of the economy. We'll look more at industry and agriculture and overall success next time.